So today we're talking about programs and services in the context of correctional systems. In the United States, corrections includes prisons, jails, probation, and parole. For the majority of this lecture, I'll be talking mostly about jails and prisons and the different forms of those things, and less about probation and parole. So a great deal of imagery that you see either on the internet, movies, or television about corrections, particularly prisons and jail, is usually biased and not very accurate. Some of the reasons are that things such as doing time, that is being housed or incarcerated in a prison, is actually fairly boring and doesn't translate well to movies and TV. And that's why they tend to focus on things like violence and action-packed imagery that catches your attention. What's also lost in these media images are any sort of successes or positive outcomes that happen while people are incarcerated. For the general public, the research seems to suggest that public opinion views prisons and jails as a place that people just go to, something that's separate from society, and often they don't think about, public opinion doesn't include consideration of people who return from prison and jail. So while incarcerated, most prison systems and jail systems have a division or a department that is titled Programs and Services. They work in conjunction with the other side of the house, which is called operations or security, and they tend to work together. Programs and services are designed to help address gaps or needs within the inmate population, and they also are often focused on the needs of staff, which is a group that is almost always excluded from media imagery. In fact, most people in the general public will focus with almost tunnel vision on inmates and forget about correctional officers, mental health staff, medical staff such as doctors and dentists, as well as the myriad of staff that come and go to prisons and jails every single day. The process of programs and services tends to follow a U-shaped curve of prisonization. And this is a curve that's been known by criminologists for quite some time. The idea is that when incarcerated, a person has to learn a different set of behaviors. They have to adjust to their environment. That's often why this early period is a vulnerable period where people may hurt themselves through self-harm or suicide, or they may act out and hurt others. The middle part of the U-shaped curve is when the person becomes acclimatized, accustomed to being incarcerated, and while it might not be comfortable, it may not be pleasurable, they get a sense of the place and they adapt to the prison or to the jail. And then the last part of the U-shaped curve is when inmates are being prepared for release back into society, and we call this release or re-entry programs or strategies. So as you can see, as these three phases of an inmate's time while incarcerated change, there's also a need to change the type of programs and services to meet those needs over that different change of time period for each group. Of course, there's another range of services that deal with females versus males, juvenile populations, geriatric populations, as well as vulnerable populations such as mentally ill inmates, LGBTI inmates, elderly inmates, female inmates who arrive to prison pregnant and may deliver their baby while incarcerated, and a whole range of other inmates with special needs and gaps in their time before they were incarcerated. Why is this important? Why do we need to have programs and services for inmates? Well, one of the arguments is that the recidivism rate in general is fairly high, and there is a direct linkage between addressing these needs and the increased risk of what happens if you do not address the needs when the person is released. So recidivism can be measured in a number of ways. There's about 4 different ways it can be measured. But if we simply look at inmates who spent time in prison and then were rearrested 3 years later, we'll see that about 2/3 or about 68% are rearrested within 3 years. That number rises to 76% that will be rearrested over 5 years. And if we look at youthful offenders, such as the 18 to 25 group, we're starting to hover around 90% that will be rearrested following release. So this seems to suggest that 2/3 or more of prison inmates that are released will, for a variety of reasons, be rearrested, and many of them will return back into the prison system. So to break this cycle, there is a need to identify what is missing, and there's a range of ways to do that, and also how to address these needs, not only to improve institutional behavior while incarcerated and to address mental or physical health needs, but also ultimately to impact the recidivism rate, because those returning arrest rates often lead to violations against victims, either violence or in some cases not violent, but equally devastating for the community. As I mentioned, the media image of corrections is that prison is a place that inmates go and they seem to disappear. A lot of people think that when they're watching a movie or a television show that inmates simply disappear, and they're often surprised to hear that 95% of all prison inmates will at some point return back into society. Another way of stating that is 5% of people who go to prison will either stay there for life until they die or will pass away while in prison. That means that almost all inmates return to society. They don't all return to different geographical locations equally, and as a result, communities of low socioeconomic, often inner city or minority communities, will disproportionately receive inmates into their community, which can overwhelm an already fragile community. So for many people, they view incarceration under a punishment philosophy such as retribution, deterrence, or other forms of harsh punishment. But there is also an argument to be made that programs and services and the time an inmate is incarcerated is actually a social investment. Much like it's an investment in students in college, it's an investment in individuals who are sent to prison and jail. The approximate price in my state right now for an inmate for the taxpayer is around $26,000 a year. That includes all incarceration costs from bed to food to health care. However, there's great diversity in that price, as some inmates will consume a lot more resources, particularly if they have physical and mental health needs. And as a result, that number is somewhat skewed. Some of the inmates will cost $10,000 a year, say, for their incarceration. Regardless of the cost, it is an investment. And the question is if 95% of the population returns to society, what is the taxpayer's investment on this incarceration period? This also deals with issues of restoration and the potential for rehabilitation through these programs. So as I mentioned, this division of programs and services, which you'll often have a division director, associate directors, and a hierarchy that falls under it. In some cases, you may even have a victim services department who will be responsible for notifying victims that inmates will be released and those type of functions. In some, you may have linkages to probation and parole. This group tends to play a major role in the health and well-being, and also the criminogenic factors such as institutional behavior and recidivism. The division of operations, also called security, complements this division. It's somewhat of a left hand and a right hand that in a working system, they should be functionally working together. Operations or security issues will always be the most dominant decision-making tool. Issues such as violence, escapes, and other threats to the security of the institution obviously come first. However, if you think about it, correctional officers are not armed like regular police with a weapon, with a gun. I've heard officers say before that their best weapon is actually their mouth because they need to know how to talk to people effectively. But at any time in most systems, inmates have a simple number advantage over staff, and in dysfunctional systems that can lead to things like riots or violence and these type of threats to the security system. So the division of programs and services can actually be very valuable to the security of a facility because they can keep inmates involved in activities and also present some sort of hope for moving them towards release and re-entry back into society with linkages back into the society. So in a functional system, as I mentioned, these two divisions should be working together, particularly when there's issues of security meeting issues of programs and services. Now, the terms programs and services are used pretty much to mean the same thing. If there is a slight difference, programs usually focuses on structured activities, classes, and practices that are provided to not only inmates but also to the staff, and the range of these programs is rather extensive. Services, if you think about the term service, it means to serve. So you're thinking in a strict definition of things like church service or community service, such as when you see the inmates picking up trash along a freeway or those type of activities. But for all purposes, the terms programs and services can be used pretty much to mean the same division. While these terms overlap, they tend to drive at addressing those gaps that I mentioned. And some loose categories involve issues of wellness or well-being. And this can be for inmates at all sorts of activities, but for staff, it can also focus on things like stress reduction and debriefing after they witness a traumatic event or experience a traumatic event, these type of services. Health issues, that includes physical and mental health. Therapy, and there's a wide range of therapies. Education, which prison and jails tend to have an educational system that is linked to the county and the state that functions much like any other school system with school teachers and with the goal of often getting prison inmates a GED or some sort of certificate, moving them towards a graduation. In some cases, this even includes college degrees that inmates can take while incarcerated. Employment, which is often the number one factor for reducing recidivism, is providing some sort of training and pathway towards getting inmates employed as they leave, improving some sort of skill sets, whether that's something like welding all the way up to computer skills. And these general terms focus on any sort of rehabilitation, community service to keep those linkages with the outside of the prison world, the community. And they also include things like recreation. I've witnessed little old ladies teaching knitting to inmates, and they were all sitting around knitting, and they learned how to knit and sew. So you're often surprised when you visit a prison just how wide-ranging and different some of these programs and services are. So as a result, what I'd like to do next is go through some examples. I typically don't talk about my work too much in a class, but for this purposes today, I'm going to focus on some of the program evaluations or topics that I've actually researched in my career, and then invite you to look at some for yourself. So one topic that a lot of people do not think about is visitation to a jail or a prison. On average, about 1/3 of all prison inmates receive at least one visit per year. That means that about 2/3, or the vast majority, do not receive any sort of visit. And as you can imagine, there's a variety of reasons for that. Some, as a result of their crime, their family somewhat disown them or feel disconnected. Some, it's a socioeconomic challenge to get to the prison or jail, particularly if the person's incarcerated a distance from where they live. And some may never even had that family linkage or support before they were incarcerated. But visitation serves a very important function as it keeps the social connection linked from inside the prison to outside. Within visitation practices, there's a great deal of variety. For example, a large number of prisons, female prisons, will arrange for visitation to be conducted where there is a more child-friendly environment. So as to not traumatize or upset the children when they visit, it can occur in an environment that looks a lot like a school with artwork on the wall and things for kids to play with while they're visiting, to give it a more natural feeling, to facilitate the visit and to encourage a healthy visit while also keeping children somewhat protected from the prison environment. In this case, you also have females that may have been pregnant while incarcerated, and they may actually give birth in prison and jail. And so the children can be a wide range of ages and essentially starting from the day of their birth. The research on the topic of visitation, one of the criticisms or challenges that routinely shows up is that visitors often experience degradation and humiliation when they visit their loved one. And having these type of policies can that encourage a very punitive way of conducting a visit can lead to a lot of poor outcomes. One of the reasons is that for a number of security staff, visitation is an opportunity for visitors to pass contraband, cell phones, drugs, or other contraband items to the inmate. So when they enter the prison, the families often have to go through the same security procedures as anyone else would be entering a facility. This means taking, much like an airport, taking off your belt, taking off your shoes. You cannot take a cell phone in, you cannot take tobacco products in. And one of the complaints is that the rules are varied, they change all the time, they may not be posted, and it keeps the visitors guessing, and it leads to poor outcomes from the visit. Some of my work on some more modern jails shows that because people are incarcerated for a shorter period of time in jail, some of the visitors preferred this type of visit where they would actually go to a remote center, which looks kind of like a Department of Motor Vehicle center just in a strip mall or off site from the jail itself. And then they would talk through a screen to the inmate, having no physical contact, but they wouldn't have to go through a typical security procedure at the prison or jail. When I do talk about these different approaches, there's not one approach that is the most beneficial approach, but programs that center around visitation efforts that encourage positivity can lead to a number of good outcomes, not just for the visitors, their children, but also from the inmate. The inmate often returns from a visit. It can be an emotional visit, but for many inmates, this is the highlight of their week or their month. And so depending what happens on that visit can dictate their behavior following the visit. When I teach this class and talk on this topic, invariably students and the general public always bring up the topic of conjugal visits as part of visitation. In today's punitive climate, conjugal visits are rare. When they do occur, prison systems tend not to advertise or talk about them too much. And that's somewhat of a separate topic, but it is interesting that that's often a place that people will ask a lot of questions about. Another topic that I'd like to discuss is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. This is a program that I worked on as a state evaluator for about 8 years, conducting a whole range of studies from samples of wardens to prison administrators to inmates and to correctional officers as well. And I used a bunch of different methods to understand how this policy, or this program was being carried out in the prison system. So we start with an interesting definition that often challenges people. And this starts with the idea that issues of rape and sexual harassment are actually not about sex. They're about power and control. It's not based in some sort of sexual communication. It's based in the topic of sexual violence and the need to dominate another human being. This is another topic when I teach that students bring up a lot, but it's also based in the media because if you think about media representations of this topic, you often hear terms like don't drop the soap or Big Bubba's going to get you, or these type of ideas. It's often rooted in some sort of sense of a universal justice. And by this, crime, I think, can be very complicated and challenging to some people, particularly if it's of a sexual nature. As a result, an easy solution is the idea that if people are violent and hurt other people, that there's some sort of cosmic or universal justice that will occur when they're incarcerated. This is not true. There is no research to suggest it's true. In fact, the person who is a predatorial type offender, who uses violence and control over others while on the street, will often be the same type of person while incarcerated. And there are a number of offenders who are not violent, who cannot protect themselves, and they are often targeted on the street, and they will also be targeted while incarcerated. So this idea of a universal justice is often what we call a rape myth. And rape myths go back to the feminists during the 60s and the 70s. And there's a huge body of research that suggests that people who have more rape myths in their vocabulary, who believe in these things more, are actually more likely to ignore, dismiss, or not get involved in actual cases of rape or sexual violence. In some cases, they may be even more likely to engage in it themselves. So a very traditional rape myth, not thinking about prison, is this idea that a woman was raped because she was wearing certain type of clothing. Other rape myths are a woman actually likes being raped, they just don't know that they like the sex until they're being raped, and then they change their mind. And other myths that obviously now we know are false. For some reason in prison, there's still a number of rape myths that the community holds. And over time, and perhaps with programs like this, that can change. So PREA has actually been around for a while. It was first enacted in 2003 by George Bush. And its general goal was to eliminate sexual abuse while in confinement. Confinement is prison jails, but it also includes settings such as juvenile detention centers and immigration centers and other forms of confinement. The focus is on safety and zero tolerance for sexual abuse. One important note is that it was enacted by George Bush, who is, of course, a Republican. And the reason this federal law was enacted fairly fast is because it had very little resistance. The idea of prison rape being something that society accepts and tolerates, while you may see comments on the internet, is actually not really something that people support. So George Bush, a right-wing Republican politician, enacted the law. At the time, there was an emphasis on compassionate conservatives, and the idea that you may not support what the inmate did, but creating environments where sexual abuse is tolerated or even rewarded is a violation of human rights and is unethical. So in the project that I worked on for the 8 years, I had to evaluate a range of these programs. One of the groups that came down to help with the program and to teach the program is called Just Detention International, or JDI for short. This is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. So they're based in Washington, D.C., and when a particular state agency, such as a prison system or a jail system, receives a grant, they are the group that comes in and are responsible for the programming, the education of inmates and staff. And my job was to evaluate how each phase of PREA rolled out. They have a very good web page. The link is here. And you can see in the image, on the left image, it says, if this woman was being raped, would you help her? And now we see the same woman in a prison garb or prison outfit. And the question is would you think of that victim, or the correct term is that survivor, in the same way? On their web page, and I suggest you take a look at it, and they have a range of survivor stories. Just one trigger warning, some of the stories are graphic and they're not censored. The language has been tinkered a little bit just to make sure that you can read it and it makes sense. But they are some pretty graphic stories, but they're real stories. And so rather than follow media accounts, Just Detention International, or JDI, presents real people's stories and experiences while incarcerated. In some occasions, the offenders were other inmates, and in other situations, the offenders are actually correctional officers. But there's a range of stories there, as well as resources and education. So the context of what JDI and similar organizations do is they will arrive at a facility and they will begin a series of programs for inmates. So the first step is some sort of basic education program. This can include an issue of inmates' rights. What are the legal rights that an inmate has? It also includes issues of reporting. How can an inmate who is being the victim of sexual abuse, how can they report an incident beyond the immediate facility, particularly if the offender is a correctional officer or staff member who is around them all the time? One solution, and you can see on this hotline, is that within units or dorms in prison, inmates can often have a kiosk or a phone, and on this they can fill out reports of an incident, and they can do so in a confidential manner. Reporting an incident, and this is important, does not automatically mean that the survivor or the victim of the crime must follow through with it. They don't necessarily have to press charges or go to court or do any other act. Reporting is just step one, but they will receive support from a specially trained officer, either at that prison or from outside the prison, who can meet them in a confidential setting and offer them services and find out what action, if any, they would like to take. Services can include physical services, so it could include such things as HIV testing or a rape kit, which is a kit that to test if a person's been sexually abused for purposes of a court or legal proceedings. Or they could also be offering counseling and mental health services. Just Detention International also constructs and delivers the programs from staff. Staff are under a zero tolerance mandate, which means regardless of whether it's a consensual relationship between the officer and the inmate, staff need to understand that they can be charged for that behavior, beginning with losing their job all the way up to some sort of legal ramifications. Staff are often around inmates for long periods of the day and over periods of their whole life. And it is inevitable that not only in terms of sexual abuse, but consensual relationships, they do occur. This creates a security risk for a couple of reasons. One, in a consensual relationship, the inmate may now have some sort of leverage or control over the staff member. And vice versa, the staff member automatically has, by power of their job description, status and power over the inmate. So as a result, there is zero tolerance for these type of relationships. Just Detention International and other organizations also help staff in terms of the correct responses and treatment for survivors of sexual abuse in prison. So officers, correctional officers, as well as therapy staff are all on the same board, and there's a standardized set of responses that they follow following a reported event. So this is a repetition. However, I'd like to show you a member of Just Detention International board. And this is what she was, Jan was previously incarcerated, and she had an incident, and her quote, looking back, she says, "I had no safe way to report my assault, no place to get outside counseling, and no information about my rights. I can't go back and change what happened to me, but I can help make sure that it never happens again. That's why I fought along Just Detention International for strong PREA standards." So a lot of the survivors work for the agency as well as other agencies in order that other people who incarcerated don't experience the same degree of helplessness, and it doesn't lead to a culture of violence. Beyond the impact on the individual, if sexual violence occurs, it makes the facility or the prison as a whole much less safe. So it actually drives at a bigger issue, which is safety. Some of the signs, and this is a sign that you'll see in different, something similar to in different prisons and jails. In this case, it uses the term resident for an inmate, what we would typically call an inmate. But there's signage that's placed around as well as the education. So this sign says, in accordance with the zero tolerance policy and PREA, the facility aims to provide a safe, humane, and secure environment which is free from sexual abuse and sexual harassment. It's often surprising to people that it includes sexual harassment, because this includes such issues as saying inappropriate things from inmate to inmate or staff to inmate, commenting on somebody's physical body, and sexually harassing through other acts that may not just be physical. The goal is to maintain a program of prevention, which is always preferable. But if incidents do occur, then it's detection, response, investigation, and tracking. It's important to have a tracking system for complaints about violations of PREA standards, as well as follow-up investigations. The PREA prohibits sexual misconduct in a range of settings: prisons, jails, lockups, which are often short-term detention centers, what we used to call drunk tanks, juvenile facilities, immigration, ICE detention, and it involves what we typically would refer to as inmate on inmate or staff on inmate violations. It's also important to put up a notice and that everyone in the facility can see that offenders will be subject to discipline and possible prosecution, that there are some teeth in this policy and this program. Moving on to another program that I've researched. I spent 3 years looking at character-based units. Originally, these were called faith-based units, as religious groups would come into a prison or jail and conduct different programs. So to make it easier for the prison, they would group what we would call good inmates. That's not the best term, but these are inmates who have demonstrated stability in terms of their behavior while incarcerated. The reason good and bad are not great terms is that often in prison, and prison being very high in terms of mental health inmates, acting out, not following institutional rules may not always be a strict definition of the person acting good or bad. In some occasions, and a lot of occasions, it can be the symptoms associated with mental illness, and that can cause a person not to be able to follow the rules. However, generally, character-based or faith-based dorms clustered these good or inmates who had not demonstrated any sort of behavioral problems in one unit or dorm. They were originally faith-based, as in America it was predominantly a Christian-based religious groups that would come in. As these programs would develop and more programs were put in one unit and more trust was earned, they would grow, and there was often a recognition that maybe faith-based was excluding other faiths, including maybe atheists or non-faith. And so the term was then changed to honor dorms, and the more modern term is a character-based unit. They all tend to describe essentially the same type of thing. In these units, there's an increase of trust by staff for the inmates. There's usually a higher requirement for inmates to monitor each other's behavior. And as these environments remain safe, the warden and the administrators at central office will often pile and put more programs into that unit. More education, more activities, more freedom of movement. One important caveat is that in all prisons and jail, these dorms cannot progress to violate a basic rule, which is that no inmate can have power or authority over another inmate. The Texas system has a good example of what can happen if you have a trustee system where inmates actually had keys and could control locking up other inmates. No inmate can have power or authority. With that said, there can be mentorship. There can be other forms of creating a structured program where there's guidance. And that's how these character-based units continue to thrive. Within a character-based unit, I've published 2 articles about dog programs. This is just one of sometimes over 100 programs, from agriculture to education to, I've seen beekeeping, I've seen knitting, I've banned religious activities. But one that I took note of, and I thought I need to study that, as dog programs. Surprisingly, while a lot of us have dogs and assume that dogs are good for us, there's not a tremendous amount of research in the prison system on this topic. And this was surprising to me because essentially every prison system in America and almost every prison has some form of a dog program or a canine program. There's differences within these types of programs. The one that I evaluated, they would bring rescue dogs in off the street. There was an external agency, Healing Species was its name. They would come in and train the dogs a little bit, but mostly they would provide education to the inmates, and the inmates would have a primary handler who was responsible for the dog. These dogs would arrive skittish, scared, they'd often been on the street, malnourished, abused. And through my research, I found it interesting because a number of the inmates would actually see themselves in the form of that dog. As they were incarcerated, they were also scared, abused, went through something traumatic, as well as committing the crimes that they committed. It was a very powerful program to observe. They were probably some of the most loved animals that you could ever come across when you have 2 or 4 animals, dogs in a unit, and you have 300 men or 300 women looking after them. But I thought it was important to use the scientific method to actually test and see how they behaved and what type of scientific outcomes I could find. As well as being reflective of their own progress or pathway through incarceration, one of the interesting things that the inmates found was that the dogs were very much a stress reliever and a trusted ally for them, when for a lot of them humans had let them down and they didn't feel comfortable communicating in any way about trauma to humans. The dogs were an important conduit to those emotions. They were also an important conduit to other programs. And by this, I found that dogs by themselves may not necessarily have a direct outcome, but they served as somewhat as a mascot for the unit, and the men or the women would look at the symbolism of the dog and the positive emotions, as well as some sort of coping and linkage to the outside world. And they talked a lot in the research I conducted about issues of hope and transformation. So this was an interesting way to conduct research on something that was kind of actually cool just to observe and to see myself. The third party provided the training. They also provided things like shampoo and brushes and leashes for the dogs. And there are a variety of programs that fall under this umbrella too. So in contrast to the one I just described, which was at several maximum security prisons, other dog programs will actually educate inmates to train the dogs as rehabilitation dogs, such as for the visually impaired, sight impaired, and after a period of time, they're donated to a person who is in need of a dog for those purposes. Other types of programs that exist in terms of animals include everything from birds right up to horses. There's certain programs where inmates learn about horses and are engaged in training and understanding that side of things. So that's an example of three programs, programs that impact visitation, um, programs that are found underneath the PRIA policy, and programs of character-based units, and specifically the dog programs. One thing that has occurred throughout time, traditionally in prisons, is that a warden who's particularly impactful will start a bunch of programs, and then they will tell you the value of the program. And they may even write something in the newspaper or get a media response. And that's fine. One of the dilemmas, however, is that there's an obvious bias in terms of the warden wanting their own prison to look really good. So the first thing that scientists and researchers can offer is independence. We are separate from the entity, and we should have no vested interest in terms of how a program looks in terms of once it's measured. We shouldn't have a dog in the race, as they say. So this term that we see now for programs, and it's a very important term, is evidence-based programs. And these are programs that have been subjected to the scientific method. It often includes publication where you submit your research with methods and outcomes, and in some case it could be quantitative, such as numbers and measurement through numbers. In some cases it could be qualitative, such as looking at what people wrote or expressed during interviews and the words that they said. But the scientific method follows a standardized set of practices and publication that peer reviewers can look over the research and criticize and ask questions and amend, and is documented. And over time, these repeated efforts can lead to the establishment of evidence-based programs. These are programs that should be used in different contexts as they've demonstrated effectiveness in terms of some sort of outcome. Often recidivism, but not always. In prison, we may not be able to follow the true experimental design, the scientific method, where one group is randomly placed as a control group and the other one receives the exposure. And one reason for that is the ethical factors, that you often can't exclude people from some sort of program that seems to work. You can't place people at risk by putting them in one of the groups, and so on. Prison is its own world, and as such we use quasi-experimental methods, but we follow the same scientific method. In the public health approach here, we can see we have a community assessment, or that could, in prison, just be a statement of the problem. We quantify the issue, so we find out some sort of way of measuring it. We develop a concise statement. This may be a hypothesis or a research statement. We go and look at the literature. We develop a literature review, and we say, well, what have other researchers and scientists written about this topic? And then we come up with a way of measuring and evaluating it, including a plan of action, and then we have a final evaluation, often in the form of a report that can be given back to the prison system, the warden, or whoever the key stakeholders are, and also published in academic journals. Should somebody else want to research this topic, every article gets added to the body of knowledge, which is the scientific literature on that topic. For most topics, you'll find someone has written or studied it in some format. And it's important to read that in most cases before you develop your research questions and decide the methods and how you're going to study this problem and how you're going to evaluate the program. One little side note is the word prove. The hard sciences such as physics and chemistry can prove things. We deal with people, so we never prove anything. We don't say prove. We might find evidence that supports or does not support a program. And one of the other characteristics, if you want to simplify it, for evidence-based practices, there's a definable outcome. So there's something that we're looking at the end of everything. This could be recidivism, such as 3 years after release, who is being rearrested. It could also be things like institutional misconduct, who is misbehaving. And those are more negative things. It can also be phrased in a positive thing. How many inmates have achieved a GED or some sort of education outcome that is a positive thing? Number two, it's measurable. Can it be measured in some fashion? And as I said earlier, that's quantifiable, which is numbers, as well as qualitative data, which is words. And it's also defined as some sort of practical reality. We could measure it and define outcomes that are very academic or irrelevant to most of us, but it has to be something that makes sense for people, for staff members and administrators, so they can use this information. One example that I'll leave you with in terms of an evidence-based program is cognitive behavioral programs, or programs that rely on cognitive behavioral therapy. This is actually the very first form of psychotherapy where scientific methods were used. And it's actually often goes by the short term of CBT because it's such a well-known therapy that's used in prison and, of course, in the world outside of prison. It's a short-term goal-orientated therapy that is kind of a nuts and bolts practical approach to problem solving. It's based on the idea that our behaviors are actually a link of behavior, thoughts, and feelings. The principles come from behavioral and cognitive psychotherapy. And to say that it's evidence-based does not mean that it's the only thing that works, but because it's been tested from such an early age, early time period, it's demonstrated effectiveness using these methods. Review studies on CBT outside of prison and inside of prison show that for forms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, eating disorders, and borderline personality disorder, it can be very effective. When used with medications, it can be effective with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, opioid use disorder, bipolar disorder, and other sort of psychotic disorders. CBT, using this evidence-based approach, has also shown benefits and outcomes for children and adolescents, and it has shown itself to be a very fairly cheap and effective way to help in the non-incarcerated world patients and patients who are inmates understand that they can't control every part of the world around them, but how to interpret and deal with the things in their environment. That all sounds nice and fancy. Some of the actual strategies, like the nuts and bolts of how you do this, include things like journaling, role-playing, relaxation techniques, and the use of mental distractions when dealing with issues of anxiety and depression. So this is just one example of a mental health therapy that we could clearly identify as an evidence-based program. And I would like to invite you to also explore other evidence-based programs in the realm of prison and jail.